Hello, everyone. So we have spring break coming up, but then after the spring break, you have the first assignment related to your term paper. So I wanted to post a short video sort of explaining how you write a philosophy paper and then giving you more detail on exactly what's needed for this first assignment. So the text here for this PowerPoint is just taken from sample essay prompts that I posted to Moodle, but I want to go through and explain in a bit more detail. So that document gives you a few sample essay prompts. Um, I want you to write on whatever from this, any topic from this course that interests you. I want you to take a deep dive into something, and so pick whatever you think you can most successfully, dive into and stay interested in it and make a good argument. These prompts are not things that you have to write on, right? They're just examples of the paper you might write. Now, if you decide that you want to write on one of the prompts, that's fine too, right? But the idea is give you a sense, if I'm sure many of you have never written a philosophy paper, like what the scope, sort of an ambition are supposed to be. Because typically, um, people have a much broader idea of what a philosophy paper will look like than actually the case. A good philosophy paper, especially at this length, that's going to be relatively short in the end, 5, 7 pages, something like that, has to be very narrow, right? You'll probably want to be focusing on, one premise and one argument from the text. So here's just the first example. I'll go through sort of two of the examples on the essay prompts sheet. I won't go through all of them, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about for what counts as a good philosophy. I'm asking you to do philosophy, which means come up with an original idea, an original argument, right? That's not just borrowed from the text, not just borrowed from the lectures. Now, original doesn't mean that you have to do a literature review, right? You don't have to do any outside research on any outside texts beyond what's beyond the Rachels, right, and the other texts that are posted to the Moodle. You don't have to do outside research. You're welcome to if you want to, um, but even then, your idea has to be original, right? So I don't want you to find some outside research paper and then just prevent that person's argument. I want an argument that came from you, from your own head. Uh, so the way you're going to find those original arguments is not at the most, right, broad theoretical level. I don't expect that anyone's going to come up with an original theory of ethics, right? Or even necessarily an original like objection to utilitarianism. Um, where you're going to find your ideas for originality is sort of deeper into what we call the dialectic, right? So, we've read through the text, we've understood what utilitarianism is. Then we've seen some objections to utilitarianism, and we've seen some utilitarian responses to those objections, right? And maybe that's where we stopped in the text in the lecture, but we could see, a response to that response, right? And that could be where you could jump in. So here's a couple examples of where you can find originality in a very sort of narrow sense. So the first topic is on cultural relativism or subjectivism, right? So we remember we talked about subjectivism, simple subjectivism, and emotivism. This prompt could sort of cover any of those. So you'll recall that Rachel's critiques arguments for cultural relativism. I'm going to kind of focus on that version. You can sort of map this structure onto subjectivism if you prefer. Um, but both of these views, right, they offer arguments for why there is no objective morality, right, that applies to everyone. And then Rachel's has objections to those arguments. So in the case of cultural relativism, you may recall it's a very simple argument. There's one premise, right? Uh, Cultures differ in their moral codes. Their conclusion is there is no objective reality. Now, Rachel's thinks those arguments aren't very good, and he has many reasons why that argument is not very good, right? But maybe you still want to defend cultural relativism, right? Maybe you could write a paper saying, look, Rachel's is actually wrong, and cultural relativism is still good, and Rachel's objections don't work. So to write that paper, right, you have to do a lot of work before you actually get to your original part, right? So the first, I don't know, 2, 3 pages of the paper will probably be, will definitely be, right, an introduction where you give a clear thesis statement, right, a little preview of your argumentative strategy. Then you're going to need to spend a big paragraph just explaining what cultural relativism is, right? So don't write as though you're writing for me, right? A guy that knows all this stuff or someone else in your class. Write as though you're writing for someone who's never taken this class, but is intelligent enough to follow it. So maybe you're writing for your mom, right? Maybe you're writing for your roommate. So keep that in mind. You have to explain everything, right? So after you do your introduction, you need to explain what cultural relativism is. You need to explain what the argument for cultural relativism is. Right? Then you need to explain Rachel's problem with that argument, right? And you can just pick one. So Rachel's has like 3 or 4, right, different critiques of cultural relativism. Don't try to tackle all of those. Just pick one particular response from Rachel that you think you think isn't very good, and you have good reasons why action fails, and you can just focus on that particular one, right? So for example, right, Rachel's claims that apparent differences in moral values, right? That so this is his argument that the premise in the argument for cultural relativism is false. The premise being cultures differ in their moral values, and Rachel says actually a lot of things that appear to be differences in moral values are actually differences in something else, either metaphysical belief or just their external life circumstances. Right? The example of Hindus not eating meat, or the example, right, of the natives of the American North sometimes expose infants, right, when they can't care for them and stuff like that. Those are the territory, right? So you may notice that Rachel's gives a couple examples, right, of apparent moral differences that actually turn out to be not moral differences, but differences of another type. But you might come up with something that you think is actually a very clear moral difference that can't be explained away in those ways, right? And you can come with that example and develop it, and that can be an objection, right? You can say, okay, maybe Rachel's is right about eating meat in Hindu cultures, and maybe he's right about this practice with babies and in Native people, but here's another 1 or 2 like really clear examples where yes, there are differences. All you're doing, defending one premise in one argument, right? That's very narrow, and that's exactly the size, right, that you need to be right. Another way you might attack it, right, is a totally different objection that would be a totally different paper. Is Rachel says, hey, these differences in moral values can be explained by the fact that some cultures are wrong, and maybe you want to attack that argument of Rachel's, right? You could well, again, don't try to do all of them. Don't try to address all of his objections. One very narrow objection to Rachel's, develop it, and importantly, consider objections, right? So this is something that I find often students, even though this is a relatively short paper, um, they write it out and they kind of feel like they're done on, page 3, um, and then they sort of start padding and just sort of start writing that's not really directly supporting their argument. Rather than do that, right? Rather than just sort of start writing things to fill pages, think about possible objections to your argument. Now, you're going to have lots of opportunity to hear objections because you're going to get responses from your presentation from other students and from myself. Then you're going to write a draft and you're going to get some feedback from me on your draft, right? There will be lots of objections for you to consider, and that's the way to fill out space, right? You'll recall, for example, the article by Mill, right? His argument happens sort of on the first page, and most of the article is considering objections. Perfectly fine. That's how a lot of philosophy papers work. So just to take another example, here's the second prompt. Utilitarianism has been criticized for being too demanding in that it entails that the preferential treatment of family and friends is immoral, right? So this should sound familiar, right? Because according to utilitarianism, everyone's pain and pleasure counts equally. It seems to mean that, or if there's a trolley problem, right, and I had to pull the lever and my mom is tied to one track and there's 5 strangers tied to another track, utilitarianism seems to entail that I should have to kill my mom to save 5, right? Because the math. But that seems really hard. That's something about that feels wrong. Um, so maybe you might, in your paper, want to try to defend utilitarianism against that objection. Right? So the text gives us some general strategies that utilitarians can always use, and uh, their view, right? So that's nice. It gives you the strategies. You just have to use it, right? Which were, if you'll recall, contesting the consequences, biting the bullet, and so on, right? Find them in the, go back and find the lectures of the text, right? They give you some strategies that you can just employ to defend utilitarianism. So again, once again, you have to do a lot of setup, right, to let the bring the reader up to speed, right? Assume that they don't know what this too demanding objection is. You have to explain. You have to have your introduction, right? Your preview. Here's what my thesis is going to be. The point of the introduction partly is to let people know, hey, there's something original happening here. I have my own idea. Here's a little preview of what it is, right? To hook the reader in. Then you have to explain what is utilitarianism, right? Why would anybody believe it? Now explain the too demanding objection, right? And then you can get into the original part. It helps to have a very concrete sort of guiding example, right? Don't keep it too abstract. Don't keep it too quick. Define your terms. Always make sure that you're walking the reader along. Whenever you think you're being clear, you may need to still dumb it down, right? Because you know it all in your head, but the trick is getting it from your head onto the paper in a way that can get from the paper back into someone else's head and they can understand it. And that's actually a very tricky thing that needs a lot of practice. So, right, once you've done all that setup, then you can provide your objection, right, your defense of utilitarianism, and you could contest the consequences, right, and you could say, actually, if you add up the pain and pleasure involved, it turns out that there would be more pain in sacrificing your mother to save five, something like that, right? Uh, or you could bite the bullet and say, actually, yes, it is in fact totally the right moral thing to do to sacrifice your mother, and here's some more reasons why that should actually make sense to you, right? Um, that's the type of paper, again, very narrow, right? You're just defending utilitarianism against it. And then finally, at the end, you're going to need a conclusion. Your conclusion is basically going to look like your introduction, right? You can really, again, dumb it down, dumb it down. Philosophy is tricky to read, and so you have to give people lots of signposts. So say what you're going to do in the introduction, then do it in the body of the essay, and then a conclusion. Say, here's what I just did. Right? So you're not required to write that whole essay yet, right? And we will be touching base over and over about the details of how to write the whole essay. So here's what you need to do for your first assignment, which is just a brief 5 to 10 minute video presentation, right? And you're going to upload a link or even the whole video possibly to a discussion board that I place on Moodle. It's going to happen over a couple weeks. I'm going to put up a spreadsheet that has the date for each person that their video presentation is due. You're expected to watch everyone's and comment on them, right? Um, so I'll get to what a good, commenting looks like, but let's talk about what the video itself is supposed to look like. It can be as simple as, right, you're just recording yourself on your phone, right? You're just your head talking for 5 minutes. If you would rather do like a PowerPoint, you're welcome to do that, but none of that is required. Um, but here are the three things you need to explain in your video. First, just let us know the general area of your paper. Say, look, I'm going to write about utilitarianism, and I'm going to focus on, the too demanding objection. I'm going to defend utilitarianism, right? Then just give us your thesis, right? So uh, I will argue that the too demanding objection to utilitarianism, right, does not succeed because, in fact, utilitarianism does not entail your mother to save five people, or whatever it is, whatever the details of your assignment. But just briefly, here's my thesis. Then in part three, get into the argument in a little more detail. Now, I understand your argument may not be fully developed yet, right? You may have some ideas, some reasons supporting your thesis. Give us what you've got, right? You do need to give us something, and it does need to look like you attempted to do something original. So, you know, the way I grade these is if I see an honest attempt, right, come up with an original argument, even if the argument isn't great yet, you'll get all the points, right? The way you lose points, you don't attempt anything original whatsoever, and you just sort of hash some argument that's from the or in part three, you just say, I don't know, I don't have an argument yet, right? So you need to give me something, but it can be very it's early stages, right? So it's fine if it's not polished yet. Totally. So once you've uploaded that, right, or before, depending on what your date is for uploading your video, as people are posting their videos to the discussion board on their due dates, you'll be expected to comment on the video. And just an important thing I want to point out is uh, you're not helping students by just saying, "Hey, this is great. I really like it. It's really interesting," right? I appreciate that people are, want to be polite and supportive, but that doesn't really help the person develop their paper at all, right? None of the papers are going to be actually be really great yet, right? It's very early stages. So what they need from you is actually some critiques. I mean, you can be nice about it. You can say, "Hey, um, and you say that you're going to argue this, but I don't quite understand this part, right? Uh, you say such and such, but I'm not sure that's true, right? Because Mill says such and such." So offer objections, offer critiques, um, point out where it's not clear what they're saying, and they need to develop that. That's when you do that, you're actually showing right respect for your peer, right? When you just sort of check out and don't even really pay attention and just say, "Okay, yeah, sounds good," that's actually kind of showing contempt, right? That you didn't even bother to engage. So please engage with the videos, and everyone is expected on every video to post some uh, comment and asking for clarification or pushing back on parts that seem like they're not convinced. Um, so look forward to over spring break a spreadsheet that tells you the date that your presentation is going to be due, discussion board, and feel free to reach out to me with any questions you might have on what's expected of you in this little